Hi and welcome back to the Journey to Nebula Sew Along. I'm Julie Herman of Jawbreaker Quilts and I'll be your guide on this journey. This week we are working on piecing the Jawbreaker Pillow using the triangle pieces we cut from our strip sets last week. So let's get started. Following the pattern, the directions begin with having you arrange your cut pieces into 4 full hexagons. And I suggest you start with your favorites, so if you like the purple more than the yellow, so forth and so on, arrange your favorite 4. Then we're going to fill in around those 4 so that we have an area large enough that we'll be able to cut a 15.5-inch square, which will be the center of our pillow. One question that came up is someone asked, couldn't they do 4 rows, which would be stopping here, instead of 5 rows? And the answer is yes, you would have enough space to cut your square, but you'll have less variety. I find the pillow is a little more interesting and has more variety when you have the full 5 rows, but that's up to you. We're gonna work on piecing this in rows. So we're gonna start with our first row here, and we're gonna piece in pairs. So we're gonna start with those 2, then these 2, then those 2, then these 2. And you're gonna notice that you're gonna have pairs you're sewing together with straight seams that are straight of grain, and you're gonna have pairs that you're sewing together that have the piece strip set, and so those are gonna be bias seams. That's gonna be a bias seam and that's gonna be a bias seam. So when we hop on over to the sewing machine, I will show you how we treat each of those a little bit differently. Now that we've arranged our pieced triangles in our desired way to make our pillow top, we're gonna begin to sew them together into rows. And as I mentioned, we're gonna have seams that are gonna be straight of grain to straight of grain, and seams that are gonna be bias to bias. It can be helpful to pin these over at your design wall so that you don't lose track of which pieces go to which ones. That can be very easy to do with this project. So I'm gonna pin these 2 together, and these 2 are as simple as just laying right on top of each other. They're exactly the same size, and we're just gonna sew a 1/4 inch seam. And same machine settings that we've been using, which is scant 1/4 inch and 2.5 stitch length, and I'm sewing with R-Fill 50 weight color. My favorite color is the medium gray, which is 2600. So let's get started. Okay. And make sure your pin is either far enough out of the way or that you pull it out as you sew. Never want to sew over pins. Now when we're sewing this pair together, since we have bias and we have something that we want to line up, we want to be more careful. So we have 2 options. One, we can do the peel method, which is what we did week 1 with Seaside. Or 2, we can go ahead and pin these and line up the seam. Now these 2 are exactly the same size, so the points should line up in both other sides when we pin that middle, which they do. So we're going to sew a 1/4 inch seam. Okay, and then I got the next set ready to go. And I would go ahead at this point and sew all of my pairs to row 1, and then I would lay them back out, make sure that I have everything arranged correctly before I begin my next row. But for the purposes of demo, I'm just gonna open these pieces up and show you what we're gonna do. So this is another great opportunity to use the seam roller if you have one, rather than get your iron out. So I'm gonna press that seam open and do the same thing with this one. A little finger press and give it a nice little roll. Okay. Now, like I said, double check your layout, make sure that this is how it is, because you can easily kind of start to go like this and mess it up and realize you don't have that as your next piece. So double check that you have your layout correct. And then sewing this seam is very similar to the last one that we sewed, which has the bias. We're sewing bias again. But now that we're sewing 2 diamonds to each other, the alignment's a little bit different. We're still gonna line these back up in the middle. Make sure I can show you. And pin them. And then what you'll notice is the point of your triangle here goes to your dog ear of your triangle from this piece, and your notched end there is going to go to this flat side. So everything should line up perfectly like a puzzle. And we're going to go ahead and sew this seam. And this is also where a stiletto can come in handy. Don't want to get your fingers too close to the machine. And we're going to repeat this process with all of our pairs, continuing to add them on to sew all of our rows together. Now that we have our triangle units sewn together and sewn into rows, our next step is to sew those rows together. So I'm going to teach you a little trick that works well when sewing the rows together in this project. So normally we would be focusing on pinning at every intersection, but the reality is it doesn't really matter where this one lands because it's the same fabric. So I'm going to ignore this one and I'm going to focus instead here, 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 and here. Because in reality, this one's probably going to get trimmed off, that one's probably going to get trimmed off. So I'm going to focus on these 4, 1, 2, 3, 4 when I go to pin my rows together. So we're going to pin our rows together, sew the length of our rows, and then continue to press those seams open and sew all of our rows together till we complete our quilt top. So I'll see you back on over at the sewing machine. And in true Julie fashion, I actually messed up if you go back and look when I pieced these together, and I did do it opposite. So like I said, it's very important to go back to your design wall and make sure that you're sewing things in the right order so that they end up exactly where you need them for your rows. Even I make mistakes. Now, as I mentioned, we're going to focus on here, 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 and here, and we're not going to focus so much on the center pink area because the same fabric is matching up. So we're going to put these right sides together and get out my pins. Make sure you guys can see what I'm doing. And I'm going to focus on the easy ones first. So the easy ones, the ones where you see everything, which would be these pink to blue seams. So I'm going to pin both of those. And then these are a little bit harder because we've got multiple colors intersecting. So I'm going to line them up as best as I can. Put a pin. And same thing with this one. Going to kind of peel it back, double check. Pin. And then we're going to sew the length of this row. And then when we go to do the next one, I'm going to teach you a little trick that I was taught at a quilt shop once upon a time. Let's start sewing this pair together. And this is where it's very important that you've pressed your seams open because you have 6 pieces coming together here. It's a lot of bulk. And if you haven't pressed your seams open, you're going to make your machine very unhappy, and chances of it laying flat are going to be slim. So we're going to slow down at the intersection. And again, we got a lot of fabric here, so we're going to slow down, use our stiletto. And continue all the way down. And as I mentioned, we didn't pin here. You can kind of eyeball it, but if that one doesn't line up perfect, it doesn't really matter because it's all the same fabric coming together, so you're never gonna notice that. Your eye's not gonna be drawn to it. And I don't really worry about back stitching here because we're gonna be trimming it in not too long anyway, so why waste the time? Now, with our next 2 rows, make sure I have the correct next 2 rows. Yeah. I'm going to show you a trick that I learned a long time ago at a quilt shop. And don't know who invented it. If you know, I would love to find out. And it's called hang pin, is what I was taught. So what it is if I want to really make sure that I'm going to get these 2 right here to line up perfectly, this is what I was taught to do. Start with the first one, and I'm going to put my pin at exactly where the point is. So it's right where the pink and the orange, everything intersects. And then I'm going to find the matching point on this one, which is where all the pink and the green come together, and I'm going to put my pin in. And then you line everything up and you keep that pin at 90 degrees to your piece, and you want to make sure it doesn't wiggle one way or another. But you keep that pin and you let it hang there, and then you take 2 other pins and you use them on either side. And then when you remove that pin, in theory, you've lined everything perfectly up so that those points will perfectly land. It tends to work most of the time. I find it really handy, especially if you're having trouble getting your points to line up. Try this hang pin technique. So go ahead and sew the length of all of your rows together to put all 5 rows together. It's time to press these seams, and I do suggest pressing them open. So it's good to open them with your finger, use the seam roller, and then use either your iron finger or your heat stiletto to help open things as you go. And then give it a good press. And continue to move my way down. And repeat this process with all of my seams until I have my quilt top nicely pressed. Now that our rows have been pressed open, our next step is to trim this down. And the reason we're trimming it down is because this is the look we're eventually going for, which is our hexagons surrounded by a thin inner border and a thicker outer border and some binding, so 3 different places to give some supporting fabric. Now there have been some talks in the Facebook group, people who are afraid to cut theirs, they don't want to trim things off. You can always finish this as a table topper, as a different shaped pillow. You can add more pieces. This project is yours to make how you see fit. So I'm going to show you how the pattern's written, and then you can do as you want. So there are 2 options now for trimming this down. The one is a large square ruler, and I know not everyone has a super big large square ruler, so I'm going to show you the other method, which just uses 2 standard rulers, which hopefully most of you will have in your stash. Okay. So we're going to begin by cutting our first side, which I'm going to choose to cut the top. And based off of the diagram, the pattern, I know that I want to cut a little bit above this line here. I know this can seem scary to cut apart something that's pieced, and it's not that bad once you just go for it. So I'm going to go about 3/4 of an inch above that line, and I do have it on there so that I know that I'm straight. It doesn't necessarily matter if I want to move a little more up or down, but I do want to make sure I'm straight and not crooked. So line up my marks and just go for it. Okay, so first cut done. Now the next cut I'm going to do is going to be this side. So I'm going to turn it so that, because I'm right-handed, and we want to be getting a 15.5 inch square. So I'm going to put my 15.5 line on the cut line I just made, and I'm basically going to go as far over this direction as I can until I reach an area where I would no longer have something over there. So I'm going to line up 15.5, make sure I'm straight, and give another cut. So the first 2 sides were the easy 2. Now the question is, how, if we don't have a large ruler, do we accurately cut the right and the bottom? Some people would use the cutting marks, the lines on your mat. I highly advise against that. Unfortunately, every mat is different. The lines tend to be thicker than the lines on your ruler, and they tend to be a lot less accurate. So I have a different method that I will show you, which is, I know that this ruler is 6 inches wide. So 15.5 minus 6 gives me 9.5. So then I'm going to take this ruler to 9.5. So 9.5 plus 6 gives me my 15.5. And if you're like, are you sure? Is that right? You can always take this whole ruler across, move it for a minute, check, yep, 15.5. So I'm going to line that back up and line this, make sure I'm good with my marks, which I am, and go cut again. And these pieces you're trimming off are fun to make some mug rugs to use with the rest of the scraps that you didn't use in piecing your top. Lots of possibilities you can do with the scraps. So I'm going to turn to cut my last side, and I'm going to do the same thing. 6 plus 9.5. So 9.5 here, and 6 here. And my double check is, yep, 15.5. Get that lined up. And my last cut. So there we go. Now I have my piece cut, ready for borders. Now we're going to begin to add our borders. For my project, I chose to use the lightest colored fairy dust and then a purple that is actually in my pillow, but in the border you can see the full rainbow hexie that Tula designed. So we're going to start with the inner side borders, and we're going to pin them in place. And naturally, it would make the most sense to sew with the smallest thing on top and to pin from here. But because we have so much going on the other side, it's actually better to sew it this way. So what we're going to do is just put 1 or 2 pins in to start to hold it in place. Or maybe 3. And then we're going to flip it over. And now we're going to pin from this side, because this is the side we're going to sew, and then we're going to pull the pins back out from the other side before we begin. I'm going to work my way down. And then this is one time I definitely advise to pin, because it's real easy to stretch things or lose track of where this border piece is, since you're putting the smaller piece under when we get to the machine. So now we can flip that piece back over, and I can pull out the 3 pins that were just kind of my placeholders at the top. And now I'm going to repeat the same process with this side, and then I will see you on over at the sewing machine. Now that we're on over at the sewing machine, as I mentioned, we're going to be sewing with the bigger piece on the top, which is not probably what you're used to, and the smaller piece on the bottom. And the reason we're doing that is because this border piece is straight of grain, and our pillow piece has a lot of bias edges and a lot of seams, and it's going to be easier for us to control that and make sure things don't flip or go in the wrong direction when it is on the top and not on the bottom. And I'm not going to backstitch because we are going to continue to add border pieces. I'm only going to do that with the last 2. And I'm going to pull pins out as I go. Again, never want to sew over pins. And I'm going to use my stiletto to hold down my open seams. And as needed, I'm going to adjust, make sure things stay perfectly lined up. I'm just going to sew the length of the side. And I'm going to repeat this process on the other side, which I have pinned, and then I'm going to go press these to the border. I'm not going to press them open, I'm going to press them to the border, and I'll show you that in a moment. I have my 2 sides completed and pressed, and normally, as you know, I like to press open, but in this case I suggest pressing to the border piece. There's a lot of bulk in the pillow top and there's no bulk in the border piece, so it's just easiest at this point to press out towards the border piece. And then the next step is taking the top and bottom borders, pinning them in place. Again, I would suggest sewing with the border piece on the bottom once it's pinned, and then this on the top so you can guide as well as possible. Now that I have my inner border sewn on, my sides and my top and my bottom, it's time to do my outer border. And this one, it doesn't matter which side you sew from, because now we're sewing it to another border piece. So this is just straight sewing. So I'm going to go ahead, 1/4 inch seam either side, press those towards the border, add my top and bottom. Once you have sewn all your borders on and finished your pillow top, now it is time to quilt it. And just like we did with Lucky Charm, we're going to layer this with batting and muslin. Since the inside of the pillow won't be seen, we'll use muslin, quilted however you like. The one difference between this one and between Lucky Charm is Lucky Charm didn't have binding, and this one does. So we're going to assemble the back a little bit differently. We're going to make the back pieces the same way, but then instead of sewing everything together inside out, we're going to take this once it's quilted, flip it over, and right sides out, we're going to lay our two back pieces, pin everything, baste 1/8 of an inch away, and then, like it's a regular quilt, we're going to sew our binding onto the front and flip it over to the back to finish our quilt. And out of curiosity, if you're wondering why do some of my pillow patterns have binding and some of them don't, it's really just a design decision. I made the decision that with Jawbreaker, I thought it needed the little bit of the accent, the inner border, the outer border, and the binding, and that with Lucky Charm, it just kind of floated off to the edge and binding would not have helped to the design. So that's generally how I make my decision one way or another. So go ahead and get your pillow top together, take a picture, post it to Instagram. Make sure to use the hashtag #JourneyToNebula to be entered into this week's giveaway. And if you have any questions, go ahead and ask them wherever you're watching this video. And remember, we also have our community Facebook group. They're a great resource as well. And I look forward to seeing you back here next week.